Hello everyone and welcome to the Law for Liberty channel. This is our first video in our California Justice video series. In this series, we dive into important but largely overlooked aspects of California law that every Californian should know. And I thought it would be best to start off with California's multi-crime discount. That's right, this is not clickbait. California actually has a discount for defendants who commit multiple crimes. Well, to be more precise, when they commit multiple felonies. I guess it might be more appropriate to call this the California multi-felony discount. Anyways, like many of the things that we will be discussing on this channel, some might have a hard time believing that California has, on the books, in plain sight, a discount for defendants committing multiple felonies. For those skeptics, we've included the exact Penal Code section that provides this discount. Penal Code Section 1170.1. Now, in order to make sense of this code section, we first have to understand a few basic things about California sentencing. First, most crimes in California, except crimes with indeterminate life sentences, have an upper, middle, and lower term. This is also known as the sentencing triad. These are three options for the court to choose from based on the specific facts and circumstances of the case. The default term is the middle term. The upper term can be imposed if there are certain circumstances in aggravation, such as if the victim was particularly vulnerable. The court can also impose the lower term if there are certain circumstances in mitigation. For example, if the defendant was only a passive participant or played only a minor role in the crime. To take a look at an example, we can look at second-degree robbery. It has a low, middle, and upper term of 2 years, 3 years, and 5 years. We've called this a 2-3-5 triad. All right, the next concept that we have to understand in order to understand California's multi-felony discount is concurrent versus consecutive sentencing. When a defendant is convicted of more than one crime, the punishment on each crime can either be served concurrently, meaning all at the same time, or consecutively, meaning that the defendant first serves his punishment on the first crime before he begins serving punishment on a second or subsequent crime. To see how this plays out in practice, let's take a look at an example. Let's say a defendant committed a robbery and then a carjacking to escape. We'll say that this was a second-degree robbery. We'll also suppose that the defendant received the upper term on both counts, meaning he received 5 years on the robbery and 9 years on the carjacking. Now, this is before we get to the California's multi-felony discount or any other types of statutes that would reduce a defendant's sentence. In this scenario, the defendant's maximum exposure or his maximum sentence would be 14 years because he would first serve 9 years for his carjacking. Then he would serve 5 years for the robbery. However, if these punishments were served concurrently, the defendant's maximum exposure or his maximum sentence would still just be 9 years. This is because under concurrent sentencing, while the defendant is serving his 9-year sentence on the carjacking, he's also getting credit for serving time on the robbery. So by the time he's finished his carjacking sentence of 9 years, he's already also finished the robbery. So the robbery won't cause any additional period in confinement. Now that we understand the upper, middle, and lower terms of the sentencing triad, as well as consecutive versus concurrent sentencing, we are finally able to understand the California's multi-crime discount. Once again, this is Penal Code Section 1170.1, and I've pulled it up here so you can follow along with me. Now, what this code section does is break up the total sentence, also known as the aggregate term, into 3 distinct parts. You have the principal term, the subordinate term, and any additional term imposed by applicable enhancements or prior convictions. Now, the principal term is just like what it sounds. It is the primary offense of which you're convicted, the most serious offense, meaning it is the crime for which the longest sentence was actually imposed. The subordinate term just means any other crimes or any other punishments other than the principal term. And the additional term, just as the statute says, is any additional punishment applicable for enhancements regarding prior convictions, prior prison terms, and the like. So in order to get your total sentence, or the total aggregate term, you add your principal term, any subordinate terms, and the additional term. Going back to our hypothetical, we can see that the carjacking is going to be the principal term because it is punishable by 9 years. The robbery is only punishable by 5 years, and so it will be the subordinate term. And in this hypothetical, there are no additional terms. So our sentence is either 14 years, if consecutive, or it'll be 9 years if served concurrently. Now, with all of that in mind, it's this next sentence here in section 1170.1 that really does all the damage. I've highlighted it here so you can follow along. It says the subordinate term for each consecutive offense shall consist of 1/3 of the middle term of imprisonment prescribed for each other felony conviction for which a consecutive term of imprisonment is imposed, and shall include 1/3 of the term imposed for any specific enhancements applicable to those subordinate offenses. All right, so what does all that legal jargon mean? It essentially means that judges must impose all subordinate crimes concurrently. Or the judge wants to impose a consecutive sentence, it is automatically reduced to 1/3 of the middle term. Now, going back to our hypothetical, we discussed a robbery and a carjacking. Now, they each have different sentencing triads. The robbery is 2, 3, and 5 years. The carjacking is 3, 5, and 9 years. Now, remember in our hypothetical, when the defendant is sentenced concurrently, the subordinate term, or the robbery, has 0 impact on his total sentence. Instead of 14 years, it was still just 9 years. Now, that same logic applies no matter how many additional offenses a defendant commits. So let's say in that example that our defendant also commits another robbery, commits domestic violence, and he commits another hit and run. Adding these all together, we could have over 18 years of additional exposure. We could have a 27-year sentence for all these crimes. However, if they're imposed concurrently, that 9-year sentence is never going to change. The defendant won't spend a single additional day in jail for the second robbery, the domestic violence, or the hit and run. So let's say the judge doesn't think that's fair, and he wants to impose a consecutive sentence for both robberies, the domestic violence, and the hit and run. Now, the maximum punishment, as we discussed before, assuming that all of these offenses were imposed at the upper term, would be 27 years. However, after the effect of Penal Code Section 1170.1, the multi-felony discount, the maximum exposure is just 13 years. No matter how bad the second robbery, the domestic violence, or the hit and run, no matter how many aggravating circumstances there might be, the maximum punishment that could be imposed for those offenses after the discount is just 4 years collectively. You may have noticed that for much of these offenses, that discount is actually more than 66%. This is because it's not just a 2/3 discount on each of these felonies, but they're also automatically reduced from the upper term to the middle term. The 2/3 reduction applies after the offense is already reduced to the middle term. So for example, the second-degree robbery goes from 5 years upper term to 3 years middle term, and then is reduced by 2/3 to just 1 year. If the defendant in our hypothetical just committed this second-degree robbery, he could have faced 5 years in prison, but because he also committed a carjacking, the robbery is reduced by 80% to just 1 year maximum. Well, there you have it, California's multi-felony discount explained in just under 10 minutes. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see similar content, please like and subscribe below. Also, what are your thoughts on California's multi-felony discounts? Let me know in the comments below.